Alan Akana, the Kahu, or pastor of Koloa Union Church. And our church is hosting this evening the gathering of the Kauai Association of the United Church of Christ and many of our friends and guests. So I welcome each and every one of you here today. And I thought it would be nice just to, so that all of us that don't go to these meetings normally can kind of see some of the other clergy that are my colleagues. So if you are a pastor of a church on the island of Kauai, would you please stand? And let's give him a hand. and please keep standing. And now, if you are a member of a church on this island, please stand. Or if you attend a church on this island, please stand. Now, and you guys come here, you come to this church. If you come at all, stand. So the few of you that are left, I want you to look around, and if you have any questions about any churches on this island, now you know who to ask. So you may be seated. And I really do want to welcome each and every one of you here. This is really a special evening. I'm really thrilled about what we're doing here tonight. And I'm just going to jump right in and make some special introductions, beginning with our guest speaker. David Vasquez-Levy is president of Pacific School of Religion and also chair of the board at Church World Services. And of course, he's involved in many other things, but we're going to present a lay to David. So Karen Johnson has a lay for David. So let's give David a hand and thank you for coming. And then I believe Michael Horning has a lay for Michelle Estrelado, who's the Director of Development with over 16 years experience in higher education. And she's right over there in the middle getting her lay. So Michelle is joining David on this trip here on this island, as well as on Oahu, where they're heading tomorrow morning. And it's just been a thrill for me to get to know Michelle. And is Carla here? Carla, come on, you get a lay as well. So Carla is David Vasquez-Levy's spouse, his wife. And she is a Hebrew Bible scholar and an IT specialist. So. And let me just say that about 5 times a year, the United Church of Christ on Kauai gets together and tries to have some kind of gathering. Sometimes we do special things like this with special guests, but I think it's important for you to see the president of the Kauai Association of the United Church of Christ and hear a few words from the Reverend Dr. Barry Mick. So Barry, come on up.
Thank you, Alan. Welcome on behalf of the Kauai Association of the United Church of Christ. We're very pleased that you're here tonight, and we're going to hear some wonderful words of wisdom from Dr. David Vasquez-Levy. And now let us pray. Lord, incline our ears and our hearts and our minds to hear the wisdom tonight shared with us here from Dr. David Vasquez-Levy. Stir within our hearts, within our spirit, the urge to do whatever we can to help, as the mission statement says, create a world where all may thrive. Through Christ our Lord, amen.
Amen, and thank you, Barry. I initially was going to do all the announcements at the end, but people keep asking questions, and I thought I'll answer some of those questions now so you don't have to ask those questions during. One question that keeps popping up is this going to be video recorded? And that's what Michael Horning is doing for the whole evening. Michael's our head deacon here at Koloa Union Church, and we will have this up on our church's website within a week. So if you want to just check out KoloaUnionChurch.org, you can, by the end of the week, you can just see the whole presentation. And David Vasquez-Levy said they'll put it up on the PSR website as well. And so I would encourage you to look for that. If you would like to share it with anybody else especially, we would love to share with people what what's happening tonight, the message. And then the other thing is, right after we're done, we've got some nice hors d'oeuvres and some drinks in Moore Hall, our fellowship hall, which is right out that door over there. And then Michelle, who we just introduced a few minutes ago, it will be at the table. And there's some material about Pacific School of Religion. If you guys have any questions at all or want to find out more information about PSR. And then we always like to have an opportunity to have a love offering. And so if anybody feels so blessed and inclined at the end of the service, on our communion table, we have an offering bowl, and you can also give at the table where Michelle will be in Moore Hall this evening. And they also have a QR code to make it as easy as possible. So with your phone, you can just click and give right like that. But I just wanted to let you know that I have been on the board at Pacific School of Religion. I've been a trustee, and I give every year to Pacific School of Religion, in part because I believe very strongly in its mission. But the last few years, Pacific School of Religion has been really intentional about training and providing resources for leadership here in Hawaii. And so you'll hear just a little bit about that later on, but I just want you to know that this is something that an effort, not only an organization, but this effort and mission needs our support. So please keep that in mind. And let's see, without further ado, I would just like to turn the floor over to David Vasquez-Levy. And then the one announcement I just forgot is when he's done with his presentation, we'll have a time for questions and answers. And just to make it easy for you, we want everybody to be able to hear. So we've got a microphone in both locations at the front of both of the aisles. So when David's ready for question and answers, if you wouldn't mind stepping right up and speaking into the microphone so everyone can hear you, we would appreciate it. Thank you very much. And David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight, for an opportunity for conversation in this evening. My gratitude to the congregation here, to Koloa Union, to Association as well, for the invitation and opportunity to participate, and to those of you who already do support Pacific School of Religion. I'm grateful because several of you who are here today are supporters of this mission and of this work. In polite company, you don't talk about politics, sex, or religion. At Pacific School of Religion, we talk about all of them all the time. And the reason is that silence on these conversations about religion, about sexuality and human understanding of ourselves, and about politics creates a vacuum and creates deep challenges for our communities. Silence around human sexuality within religious communities has led to the displacement and the disenfranchising of the gifts of many who have felt called to ministry in the church and who feel alone when the rest of the church does not stand with them. Silence around politics and religious settings has led to vacuums and the opportunity for more extreme versions of Christianity and other forms of religion to take root. We must break the silence around the issues that matter deeply to us, but to find ways to engage those conversations that do not necessarily lead to increased polarization in the way that we are experiencing in our world. A couple of years ago when I came, I shared that we are living in an apocalyptic time. That's your seminary word for the night. You probably have heard apocalypse now and all these references to apocalyptic literature. The word apocalyptic actually comes from the Greek word for revelation. So apocalyptic times are often these moments that feel like the world is falling apart. In the words of Bates's poem, the center cannot hold, things fall apart. But apocalyptic also means revelation. That when something is ending, something new may be arising. What do we pay attention to in apocalyptic times as things rise? Our time has been shaped by pandemic, by protest, and by deep polarization. So my hope tonight is that we can be engaged in breaking those silences. I expect that we are in polite company, so talking about these things will probably be a little challenging. I imagine that many of us hold a variety of views and senses about these topics, and I hope we can give each other a hearing to be able to express and to stay in the conversation, even across the depolarizations that the nation and our communities are experiencing. In a book by Parker Palmer entitled The Heart of Democracy, he states the fact that democracy must be inhabited. What he means by that is that democratic practices must be exercised. For some of you, this may be the first time you cross the door of a church in some time, and perhaps for good reason. But religious communities are democratic institutions. They are among the various ways in which in our societies we practice wrestling with each other, voting on budgets, deciding how we will designate our resources, and trying to come together to act collectively. That is religion at its best. It's not always at its best. But democracy must be inhabited. We must find spaces to occupy in which we practice what it's like to do democratic work. We are finding ourselves in a deeply challenging moment in our political life and a threat to our democratic institutions. Oddly enough, this moment has arrived through a democratic process. January 6th this year did not devolve into an attempt to stop the transition of power, in spite of the fact that the transition would mean a level of change in the things many of us care deeply about that is deeply troubling. And yet the democratic process resulted in this outcome. And so we must learn to live within it while we challenge it and remain democratically involved, inhabiting democracy. Just so you have a sense for where I'm coming from for our conversation today, PSR is a seminary. If you don't know what that means, I was sharing earlier in a conversation with Joanne Yakimura that seminary comes from a Greek word, from a Latin word. You get a second seminary word today. The Latin for seminario, which is a seed bed. So it's a place where you plant seeds, cultivate them a bit so they can grow some, and then return to the places and grow further. So we are a place of learning. One of our programs is a graduate program that folks like Pastor Kahu Akana have gone through, and many others here, to become clergy in congregations. That's a Master's of Divinity. So we have a graduate program. But we also have a lot of other programs that shape the leadership of people, both in congregations, in chaplaincy, in various settings, from the military to hospitals to hospice, as well as people seeking to make change and lead change in not-for-profit communities. But Pacific School of Religion is a particular kind of seminary. We served about 40 different denominations among our student body, and various religious traditions outside of Christianity, and about probably, I don't know what percentage, somewhere between 10 to 15% of our students do not identify with a particular religious tradition. We are a majority-minority organization. There is no majority of any kind within the student body. And we are about 55% of our student body are LGBTQ. So that creates a very particular environment to have these conversations about democracy, given the spectrums of perspective that this large, diverse group of people bring to the discussions. In 1884, one of my predecessors at Pacific School of Religion, John Knox McLean, the seminary has been around for 160 years, so this was early on in 1884. He writes as follows: "The new century promises to disclose events and conditions in society of a widely revolutionary character. what ought to be the attitude and function of a theological seminary at such a time? It ought to crave for itself due share in shaping the new order of things. Now think back to 1884. There had been a major economic crisis in a crash of the markets in the United States that affected the world. The Chinese Exclusionary Act and other exclusionary practices had been put into place to the rising of the know-nothings, of this movement of repression and exclusion towards immigrants of all kinds, and efforts to disenfranchise them from what was becoming an opportunity in this country. The Cross-Continental Railroad had just been completed, connecting the East and the West and beginning to transform the world. And particularly in Berkeley area, in the Bay Area where PSR is founded, gold had been discovered in Sutter Mill, bringing to that region people from all over the world. I say these things because what John Knox McLean is asking is the same question we must ask ourselves today. We are entering a period of wildly revolutionary character. The moment we are living in is quite significantly alarming. If you think about what brought you into the conversation today for a moment, I actually want you to do this. This is church, so we're going to do a little participation here. So for a moment, think for yourself, what brought you into this conversation tonight? What is in your mind that you are interested in? Or how are you feeling as you come into this conversation? So take a moment to think about that for yourself.
Fix this.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So, if you can call out one word of what brought you into here tonight, just out loud. This is popcorn, so anybody? Concern. Mm-hmm. Fear. Christian nationalism. How to deal. Mm-hmm. Education. Community. How to stay in conversation, how to have the conversation. So there's many things that we are feeling within our bodies, right? There's the sense that the world, again, the center cannot hold, things fall apart. We are entering into this time and into this conversation knowing that the world is going through a major transition. We see it and experience it in our own communities, in the United States, and globally. In 2023, the World Economic Forum that publishes an annual, this is the homework for Davos, the economic gathering of large nations. They publish what is called the World Risk Report, the Global Risk Report. In 2023, the Global Risk Report, published by the Economic Forum, introduced the term of a polycrisis, that the world was facing several crises at the same time. This is what the report introduction says. As 2023 begins, this is 2 years ago, when we used to think things were just fine. As 2023 begins, the world is facing a set of risks that feel both wholly new and eerily familiar. The persistence of these crises is already reshaping the world that we live in, ushering in economic and technological fragmentation. A continued push for national resilience in strategic sectors will come at a cost, one that only a few economies can bear. Meaning, as all these changes are happening, environmental changes, combined with economic distress, depolarization, the pressures of that, most economies are not set up to take that kind of a hit. The resources are too strained. Geopolitical dynamics are also creating significant headwinds for global cooperation, which often acts as a guardrail to these global risks. 2 years ago. The recognition that things are getting more intense. And what we find is then this fragmentation of everybody building walls, finding ways to identify the way to just protect their own. A deep sense of tribalism in its worst sense. So what we are experiencing, what we feel in our bodies, in our fear and in our concern, and the challenges to our democratic practices are in part the result of how the whole planet is being strained. And rather than being guided sometimes by our best instincts to lead into collaboration, we instead in fear pull away from one another. But as the report says, some of these things feel both wholly new and eerily familiar. Depending on how long you have lived, you have been through different cycles of one way or another of this pendulum that swings away from collaboration towards more isolation. In a very polarized society, it feels like whiplash. Each 4-year period or every 2 years an election is happening, it feels like the pendulum is swinging wildly between these extremes, not just between the choice between two people to lead the nation, but between two juxtaposed worldviews of how we are to achieve the well-being of our societies and our world. We got to get to the hope. I'm just naming what we're feeling and the sense of what we are facing. But we have been here before. The title for tonight's conversation focuses on Christian nationalism. So let me say a little bit about both of those words. So the word nationalism is when the pendulum swings towards that very intense tribal fear. The sense that we set boundaries around ourselves and build walls and exclude. It was the push that was shaping 1884, as John, the previous president of PSR, wrote. As the nation had gone through civil war, and in the aftermath of that made certain commitments to rebuild, to make reparations to those who had been enslaved, the pendulum swung against that, starving the government of its ability to fulfill those commitments, and led again to this period of deep isolation. But nationalism, this sentiment of narrowing the view to who belongs and who is in and who is out, whether you think of it on the question that is asked of Jesus, who is my neighbor, right? To whom do I owe the responsibility and the well-being of responsibility for them? This has been a historical human struggle to figure out who is part of my community, to whom do I have a responsibility. Nation states formed out of that kind of allegiance. Now that desire, that longing to belong, to be part of community does not have to be toxic and problematic. It can actually create cohesion around communities of particularity, of shared values, of shared instincts. But the difficulty is when it becomes so toxic that it believes that that one form of national identity or tribal identity is not just a particular expression, but is intended to be the universal one. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, there was a significant set of events that led to the ability for Columbus to take that trip and that guided his understanding of what his journey was about. The papal bull called Inter Caetera was issued by Pope Alexander the year after Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1493. And it reads as follows: the Catholic faith and the Christian religion must be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to faith itself. This was the project. 500 years of colony begins by saying, we have the gospel to bring to the world, and it is essential that we utilize any means possible to subject all the barbarous nations in order to bring faith to them. So this nationalist inclination in Europe, all these nations were forming, right? All this division of what had been the Roman Empire is fracturing into different nations. Different groups create associations and affiliations, different languages, the multiplicity of cultures that are created in Europe, but they begin to become narrowly defined. And then these nations begin to say this form of identity, this particular kind of community must then be imposed on the rest of the world. This is the best way to be human. And when that sense of nationalism gets tied to our religious identity, it becomes deeply problematic and toxic. Again, the sentiment to be part of community and to belong is not in and of itself the problem. Neither is the practice of religious conviction and traditions and efforts at understanding the relationships of human to the larger whole, to the divine, to our understandings of God. The danger is when the particular versions of either, of national identity or religious identity, pretend to be the universal. At the core of white supremacy, that is the basics of white supremacy. White supremacy is the conviction that a particular way of being human, white and male preferably, is the best way to be human, is the top of the pyramid. In fact, following the papal bull of 1493, an entire theological and political system and legal system was developed to create the framework for the colony, what was then called the Age of Discovery. It required two moves. The first one is a categorization of everything, right? Creating a taxonomy, right? If you remember from science class, you had a taxonomy book that tells you the different creatures and animals and all that, very scientific. Well, humans created a taxonomy of race. Our concepts of race that still shape so much of our daily life were formed in large part in this period, in which then, the ideas of certain groups as being in racialized communities, not just nation states, but racial communities, were fragmented and defined. And then you apply to that taxonomy, to that division, a hierarchy. And you place certain taxonomies at the top and others at the bottom. You do this by gender, you do this by race, and then you have a system to justify why you can take your God and your business all over the world and conquer the world or discover it. A couple of years ago, during the Columbus Day sale, which has now often been renamed, although right now we're in the habit of renaming other things, there was a great meme that I don't know if any of you saw it about a Columbus Day sale where just this group of people randomly ran into a store and grabbed whatever they wanted and walked out. That's a Columbus Day sale, right? So, following this period, what led to 500-year project of colonization, these ideas shaped colonies and the expansions from Europe. When these colonies, many of them, like the United States, gained their own independence, then they wanted to repeat the same exercise and begin the Western expansion in the United States immediately following independence, to begin to push out. And a very similar language and a similar theology was utilized, equating nation with religion to justify the expansion and the dispossession of native communities across the West, towards the Western expansion. If you look at the documents that were used in the Senate, in the House to justify the Western expansions. If you look at the language of the agreements that were done as the Guadalupe Treaty that took over and ended the war with Mexico by taking over a third of Mexican territory, you'll find the language of religion and the same kind of sense that this is the manifest destiny, that we have been given a particular or a particular insight from God to have the responsibility to take care of all these other people, while to return the favor, they can give us everything that's under their feet. I'm doing this historical perspective so that we can recognize that what we feel in our bodies today, what we are seeing in our country today, is this rise of Christian nationalism has deep roots within our national identity and within human existence. And that it requires similarly, because these problems are eerily, are familiar, but also eerily, or whatever, are new, but also eerily familiar, that we have also found ways to challenge them. That we have also found ways to counter the worst instincts within us. In his book, My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, a book I really commend to you as we think about how do we live with the trauma of the fear that this moment is bringing into our lives. So again, the book is My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. There's a lot that he says that is worth quoting, but I'm just going to use a really brief phrase. The deadliest manifestation of white fragility is its reflective confusion of fear with danger and comfort with safety. So let me unpack that. The deadliest manifestation of white fragility. If you're not familiar with the term, the idea is that in white supremacy, it's like, a particular group of people are the ones that control everything around us and have the right to do so. Anytime that you call that out and people freak out, is often referred to as white fragility, the discomfort with that. Now, please understand that when I'm using this terminology, I'm not talking about any one particular person. I'm talking about a system of that taxonomy and the association of hierarchies with that, right? So that's a systemic reality that's been imposed. I've kind of outlined it briefly. So calling it out is necessary in order to address it. Again, we got to break the silence. So Resmaa says the deadliest manifestation of it, the most implications of this white fragility, of the inability to handle the fact that, there are some issues, and we got to wrestle with them. There are legacies of inequality, and we must wrestle with them, is a reflexive confusion of fear with danger. Sometimes the fact that we feel afraid immediately gets translated into danger. If I walk into a neighborhood and somebody is in that neighborhood who looks different than me, and I feel fear, that does not immediately mean or equate to the fact that I am actually in danger. We must learn to separate that reaction of fear about the others, those we have been taught to fear, with an assumption that we are actually in danger. And the second one that he says is that comfort is equated with safety. That if we can care for our own comfort, then we are safe. We can pay attention to the rise of Christian nationalism over the last 50 years, in particular in the United States, in this pendulum swing. It's not just this election. A documentary called Bad Faith, that I know there's some conversation about showing the film here at the church at some point, depending on folks' interest to do so, catalogs the development of the current rise of Christian nationalism, beginning, again, as a reaction to the civil rights movement and the expansion of rights, just like there was a reaction to emancipation and the freedom of slaves, and then there's that is then reacted to in the late 1800s. Similar thing happened in the 50s with that movement. Then we get a period of repression against that. So part of that period of repression was to begin to be very intentional about training and infiltrating and exercising practices of taking over, whether it's the school board, creating institutes to study and to justify and to articulate narratives around immigration that were very negative, utilizing things like abortion and LGBTQ fears in order to challenge the society and to get this gut reaction and to recruit religious communities against issues that would otherwise not have galvanized them. At the end of the civil rights movement, it became less popular to be able to do the kind of crass language that came out of Jim Crow. But it became okay to begin to talk about abortion as this one clear divide between people and to demonize people on the other side of that divide. Similarly, it became much more expedient to galvanize religious communities around the fear of LGBTQ people. Back to Resma's encouragement and challenge, equating fear with danger is what's deadly. Just because I am afraid or confused about another way of life, another belief system, if I confuse that with the fact that they're actually dangerous, I will put up walls. I will be convinced that the people who are on my border are a threat to me and are the reason for the way everything is going wrong. So there's much more we can say about these two things, nationalism and then Christian nationalism coming together. And I'll stop here in a bit and invite our conversation and questions that may help to shape it. The spirit of the last 50 years is what led ultimately to the development of Project 2025. Which if you read it, it reads very much like a Bible that was recently sold that comes with the Constitution stapled to it. A Bible, by the way, made in China, that tries to equate, again, this is a Christian nation, and that by that it doesn't necessarily mean, yes, their Christianity has been an important part of this nation, and we should understand that. It's helpful to understand it. And for many of us, it is an important part of our life in this nation. But to equate that particularity with the universal and to say that is all that this nation is, that it is nothing else but Christian and anything else other than Christian is a risk to us, is a threat to us. That's the problem. So in Project 2025, it sort of begins to then catalog out of that one reality all these other consequences of how we should change the way our children are educated, how we should be afraid of others around their identity and how they understand themselves, how we should then begin to return, if you notice the language already, to a sense of the right we have for expansion, to name the Gulf, to retake the canal, to take Greenland back from another country, to rename, interestingly for Hawaii, Denali back to McKinley, who was the president that signed the annexation of the Hawaii Islands without the approval of the Hawaiian people. We are in a period of having to wrestle with these legacies and the feelings that we have. Perhaps some of what I said has already been controversial for you, or perhaps it's just depressing. But let me press a little further in the discomfort, perhaps. I said that at the core of it, this idea that a one form of being human, that in particular is the universal and the best way to be human, within progressive movements, and I'm going to speak about progressive movements. We can talk a lot about how conservative groups and movements have created Project 2025, the challenge that it represents and what we have to address. But I also want to think about how those of us who may see ourselves more on a progressive side of this need to engage this conversation and think about, in this moment that requires self-reflection, what we might want to consider about our way forward. In progressive movements, the best way to be human has been an assumption that humans will ultimately become secular. That religion is not something, it's either of the past, or is only, as we had a conversation yesterday with Karen, only private, right? The challenge with that idea, the challenge with it is that then it assumes that religion has no place in society. And it has rendered most progressive movements unable to speak intelligibly about religion. I'll concretize the example. In 2016 election, almost every Democratic candidate for the presidency participated regularly in religious life. Yet the one holding the Bible was Trump. In a vacuum of the inability of many progressive movements to engage religion, certainly critically, we have to do this. We have to recognize the legacies of religious traditions in shaping or misshaping the nation and creating troubles. So we need to engage it critically, but we must also engage it affirmatively or in a way that allows us to have some sense of the fact that people care deeply about their conviction and faith. That it is not inevitable for the society to simply become ultimately secular. That what we need to do is to recognize that as humans, in a world that is feeling increasingly fragmented, people, as they have throughout history, have found ways to articulate what they care for deeply, to venture ideas about that which is beyond them, the divine, and to take those religious traditions seriously. For those of us who try to stand at this intersection of religious tradition and progressive initiatives, my invitation is to speak more loudly about how your religious conviction and practices do help to shape your commitments to democracy, your commitments to a world where all can thrive. And to be more articulate about those so that when we enter spaces of progressive institutions and movements, we find way to recognize that we can talk about religion critically, but also appreciatively. In the absence of that, religion is simply rendered or handed off to the most extreme versions of itself, because there is no room for a more thoughtful engagement. For people for whom religion matters, progressive movements can easily be viewed then as soulless, as disconnected from anything that is larger, or simply not reflective of their own conviction about the fact that the world has meaning and purpose in particular ways. So what I'm saying is not necessarily that you should all go to seminary. I'll encourage anybody who wants to come, and there's a good one. But that it is valuable that we engage meaningfully in our conversations about how religion and conviction shapes the values that we do, and to break the silence about how we talk about our own conviction and values with others. To create a common public discourse, as we're trying to do here, that helps us to do that. In this moment of despair, of fear, of uncertainty, we need to create oasis. This conversation here is an oasis, right? Just about a week and a half into this current administration, many of us, I'm not going to speak for everybody here, are feeling this is alarming. The direction that we are going, a government that seems bent on leading by chaos and cruelty, is not representative of who we are. Yet it is in these communities and in these spaces, and many like these, where communities that have historically been marginalized create oases for their own well-being and resilience to be built. These days I communicate with my children, one of whom is 19 and living in Seville, Spain, doing their junior year, and one who is a senior political science major at Howard University in DC. We communicate a lot by text. My kids are struggling. They're originally from Ethiopia, so they're black children growing up in this moment of history in the United States and wrestling with what they see around them. In these text conversations, earlier today, my son expressed his frustration with many of his friends and classmates who don't seem to be engaging in this moment. And he longs for the visions that he has read about of the civil rights movement, the kind of inspiration that we have become accustomed to refer back to that period of time, to those great leaders who did this. And what our conversation has been about is that there was a reason why MLK wrote a letter from Birmingham jail, calling on mostly other church leaders to engage publicly. The letter from Birmingham jail was not written to those who were all in for Jim Crow. They were written to those who were not directly affected by the impact of repression that marginalized communities were experiencing. And to call on them to engage, to participate, to take the risks, because as he said, we are in an inextricable garment of connectivity. And when one suffers, all suffer. And when one rises, we all rise together. So I want to encourage us to think in this moment of recognizing that the movement for Christian nationalism has been orchestrated, it has been heavily funded, it has been well organized, it has developed its own policies, theologies, and understandings. We similarly must do that work to counter it, not just as an opposition to that reality, but rather to reorient ourselves in this moment as those oases of change. In this couple of days here in Hawaii, I have heard twice the image of a kipuka, that when the volcano erupts and the lava flow comes through and burns everything, just like the fires in California are burning through, there are those kipukas, those areas that survive the lava flow. There is those spaces in the crevices of the fires as a fire comes through. It is from those crevices, from those spaces, from those kipukas that the land is and the ecosystem is restored. The restoration of the ecosystem often doesn't look like that which was wiped out. It is transformed, oftentimes by the things that survived and are stronger. So I encourage us to create those spaces, those kipukas, in our own homes, in our families, in our faith communities, in our democratic organizations, in the school board, to strike that right balance that we're all feeling right now. I told my kids also that I'm microdosing on news, just so I can, know how to handle it. Many of us are feeling like I just can't even engage. So we'll need to strike a balance between not getting totally depressed and overwhelmed, but also not allowing apathy. To ensure that we are not just caught in constantly responding to the puppeteer that's going to pull strings every morning to see what kind of chaos it can create and just misdirect us and do not know where to guide. So to prevent that kind of scattered response, but at the same time to also be attentive enough to understand, to be informed, and to care deeply. Religious traditions are not always at their best, but when they are the basements where civil rights leaders gather together to learn and to train, to receive health care and medical care when they've been beat up in the protests. Religious communities are not always at their best, but when they are able to think about the big picture frameworks that will inform the ways that we work and that help us to find a new way forward. January 6th, before the last couple of years, was actually the Feast of the Epiphany. Actually, it still is. The Feast of the Epiphany is the story of the Magi that come looking for the light that they see as hopeful. When the Magi first come, they go to the places of power, to Herod's palace. But that's not where the light will come from. Instead, they are redirected to go off Broadway, to a little tiny town of Bethlehem, outside, not even of the inn, but on the back in the barn, that's the place where they proclaim this vision of epiphany for a world of good news for all people. January 6, a couple of years ago, gained a different, distinctly meaning in our nation. A counter-narrative to a world where all can thrive, to be replaced by crosses and flags that actually call for a very ethnocentric, narrow vision of the world. In that story, it ends by the Magi taking a nap after visiting Jesus at the manger, and they are told in a dream to find their way home by another way. At Pacific School of Religion, given the makeup of our community, we are made up of communities that have always had to find another way to access education, to access resources in their communities, and many of us know that in our own lives. So this is a time for us as well to find another way home. Thank you.
So I'm just going to say this is a time for question and answer. If any of you have any questions for David Vasquez-Levy, you can use this microphone or the one in the other aisle. And I'm just going to begin with the first question by saying, David, you used the word engagement or the verb engage several times. And the two words that have been on my mind a lot are engagement and activism. And a lot of people, whether they're from my church or just people that know me, will ask the question after saying something like, I can hardly stand watching the news anymore. What should I do? And the question I have for you, David, is can you give us one or two resources that you know of that will help us to engage or be healthy activists in really positive ways in our society? And before you do that, I'll just say that I've been a part of Indivisible. It's a nationwide movement that just pushes back against Project 2025 and white supremacy and Christian nationalism. And to me, that's been a really helpful way for me to connect with a group of people. Some are church people, some are not, but to say, what can we do together? What makes a difference in our community and how we on Kauai can make a difference. And I know there's a group on Maui and Oahu and all over the country, actually. But David, what would you say are some of the, just a couple resources that you would recommend to people that might be asking that same question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I would, in our work at PSR, we talk about 4 levels of change. And so I'll talk about resources briefly on each of those. The first transformative change is direct service. You see somebody who's in need of shelter, of food, of welcome, and you provide that direct service. So I would say one resource is to find those community organizations that provide direct service in your community. Many people are living in absolute fear right now. So what can you do to connect with those local communities that are trying to provide that direct service? To just engage with them, to volunteer, to participate. As we do this, our bodies shift because we are doing something rather than feeling that paralyzation. The second level of change is, of course, when you move from the direct service to some kind of, more leveraged or more larger efforts at change. So that has to do with larger organizations that may not just be local, but that they are creating change in a particular issue that you care deeply about, and to engage with those organizations or communities. That engagement can be through your resourcing of them. It can also be through your participation. So in the example here is there's a congregation that is local. There's also the association that creates that more leveraged system of providing a solution to the issues that we are facing. So how can we find resources that are connecting individual efforts? Just know, in one of our programs, we do this course on igniting vibrant ventures. It's kind of like a Kickstarter for projects. the professor who teaches this class asks a question at the beginning, and she'll ask the class, how many of you want to start your own not-for-profit? A few hands always go up, and she says, don't. There's plenty of them. Find one first. Before you start your own not-for-profit, find the one that may be doing the work that's close enough to what you want to do and partner with them. So from direct service to leverage direct service, then to policy, of course. Many of us work in that area. Resources around policy like Indivisible. There are organizations within most of our religious communities that are providing and creating resources. Certainly the ACLU, there's efforts that are being done also by congregations and churches. Each of our church bodies, the organization I am chair of, Church World Service, is an organization that does a lot of work to advocate, to try to position. Right now we are preparing several efforts to stop some of the worst decisions that are being, or executive orders that are coming that are really undermining the work around immigration, around global participation, to try to use the policies that we can to advocate for that. But the one that I'm really committed to right now that I think we need to do is the next layer of change, which is about frameworks. What is the big picture frameworks that inform the policies that are being created that lead to that leverage change and make it possible and ultimately have great impact on our direct faith? That's what theological education is to me, is the idea that what are the big picture frameworks? That's what religious communities are, efforts on the part of humans to understand a rather complex world and to try to think about what is the big picture. So I encourage you to think about what is that for you? What is your source of encouragement? In our work at PSR around theological education, we describe it by saying we want to blow your mind in our education, embolden your hearts, and strengthen your hands. The blowing of the mind is, what is the big picture? We have a number of resources on our website at psr.edu. Certainly we have graduate programs, degree programs, but we also have a lot of programs, including a theological education for leadership program here in Hawaii that is just provides short coursework, community development to be able to think about what is your source of wisdom, of understanding, whether that is in the scriptures, whether that is in other traditions that help shape your own understanding. So to really think about the resources that help to form that for you. So, other questions? Yep, we have somebody here and then back. Yep.
David, a very insightful presentation. Thank you. You mentioned that all this didn't happen with Mr. Trump coming in. It's been building up for a long time. Would you kind of tie in the thought I'm going to ask you here? We as a nation have not done a very good job of doing things when things happen to correct them before we move on. We're in the process of rewriting history in a number of areas so that people don't know what happened. I think one of the things we deal with immensely today is the fact we never really solved the problem of the Civil War. Amen. Could you talk a little bit about that and how our ability to do what we need to do is impacted by the fact there's a lot of things we just never did?
Yeah. I preached a sermon a while back on this text from, I'm a preacher, so you get a little scripture. There's a story in the Bible about Jacob and Esau. So they're just brothers. They're twins, but one's born right before the other one. Jacob is born, and when he's born, he's holding onto his brother's heel. So, even though Esau is the first one to be born, Jacob's trying to, outdo him, right? That's where you get, pulling my leg from. Anyway, so Esau, you might know the story, basically cheats his brother out of the birthright. His brother comes back, he's hungry, he's needy, and he says, hey, I'll give you a bowl of soup if you let me be the firstborn. And he agrees to it. Anyway, this leads to a divide and a breakup in the family, right? So Jacob actually has to run away and live the rest of his life abroad, elsewhere. There's a scene when he's coming back to meet his brother again. And he's at this river, right? Rivers often mark those points of transition. And he wrestles all night. He's trying to go to sleep, and there's this image of him wrestling with an angel all night. I go there because Jacob is middle-aged, having to deal with the sins of his childhood. and wondering if he can reconcile himself with his brother. The work we haven't done as a nation that's middle-aged is a willingness to wrestle with the sense of origin, right? Of the fact that this nation built itself on the cheating of our siblings out of their labor, out of their resources. It is, in fact, the push right now is to try to erase that memory. So we can do something locally in our educational boards to ensure that our children are learning those stories. We can ourselves relearn and understand them, not just to feel guilty about it, but to recognize and to struggle with what is that wrestling. In the story of Jacob and Esau, Jacob wrestles all night, and in the morning, he walks away limping. Now, this is not a Western. He's not walking off into the sunset having resolved the whole thing. He limps into a sunrise, right? So it takes that wrestling in order to build what the new day will look like. So if that makes sense, I do agree with you. I think we have to wrestle, not just with that story. We need to wrestle with the way that this Western expansion, took the lands of other people, and to find ways to understand, so what do we do about it? It's not easy. We can't just walk away from it. What does reparations look like? What does, the possibilities of, can we return somehow to everything being perfect and the way it was in some imagined past? No. But what we can do is wrestle together, be willing to identify and to tell the stories of that, and the moments in which we have learned to do that. They're plentiful as well. They don't always get the news, but there are plentiful stories of the way we have tried to, of families during the Chinese Exclusionary Act and actions on part of congregations that help people to incorporate back and to make up for the inequalities that were being lived out. In every period of exclusion and failure on the part of the nation, there have been examples of the ways that individual communities have sought to make amends, to make a difference, and to change. So whether it's in education, whether it's in the policies that we do, and at this moment, I think what's going to happen in the next couple of years will be before we can, express our vote publicly in a larger national setting, it's going to have to also be done very much in the local levels. I think back there you had a question in the next one.
You want me to come forward?
Yes.
Yeah, please. The others can hear. Yeah.
My name is Keith Dennis. I'm a member of Lahui Christian Church. And I guess I'm curious, we've been talking a lot about things, and of course, you're sharing about the importance of basically developing big frameworks, which I'm certain that's what your seminary is all about. I guess my concern is we're dealing with things that I have a hard time getting my head around. According to CBS News, Elon Musk spends $277 million, that's $250 million, to give to Trump and Republican causes. Mm-hmm. Now, through this past election, I'm getting bombarded asking for $25 here, give what you can you give me $50? And I guess it's kind of frightening to me, and that's why I'm feeling very low right now.
Yeah.
I'm sure many other people are as well.
Yeah.
But the one thing I'm thinking about is that there's a lot of people, a lot of times large organizations. I would imagine Pacific School of Religion depends on endowments from looking for how big the contributions are going to be. Mm-hmm. So I guess, and I don't want to point you out because you've got to stay in business if you're going to educate people. But I know that I've read that Princeton is giving back a sizable amount of money back to the blacks that built that institution. What are some of the things that you're doing to put your money and basically doing these things other than just giving religious ideas. What are some concrete things that you're doing in that area? I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, this is great. Actually, we're always on the spot. Remember, that's what we said, right? We're going to have the conversations. Money is another one. You don't talk in polite company. So, yeah, I mean, as an institution, we have been going through a serious discussions about how do we both steward the resources entrusted to us and recognize their legacy, right? In higher education, you know, the most interesting thing to me is that very progressive institutions that challenge in concepts ideas about capitalism depend on endowments, which are pretty much the essence of capitalism. It's the only way endowment survives. So there's a couple of things we have done as concrete examples. I'm glad to have some more conversation afterwards. The first one is to seriously reimagine the institution around the communities that have been disenfranchised. So the makeup of our student body transformed hugely in the last 10 years. But it wasn't enough to change the student body, right? I can hand out resources, whatever I can, but then I undermine the ability of the institution to support the communities we want to work with. So instead, what we have done is transform our board of trustees is also majority minority, our faculty and staff, and our student body. So we've decided as an institution that rather than simply parceling out pieces to different atomized groups, how do we change the institution itself so that it serves the communities that we are trying to be committed to, whose labor and legacies and wisdom. We have transformed what we read and how we study. Right now, about a third of our student body are Pacific Islanders. So what that means in our conversation, and many of our other faculty, staff, and students come from the Philippines, from Puerto Rico. A large portion of our student body come from island nations. So what that's doing is creating a unique space for a faculty member from Puerto Rico to engage conversations about colonialism, about statehood and relationship with students from Fiji and from Samoa and from American Samoa. So those are the places where these are unique conversations that can be set, the table can be set for those to be had. In very practical ways on our economic model, our endowment is now 40% of it is managed by women and people of color. The average for Princeton, for Harvard, is 1.4%. 1.4% of endowments of educational, actually of most endowments in the United States are mostly managed by companies that are led by white men. For us, it was critically important that we didn't just talk about it, we had to look at who is managing our resources. The thing is that in spite of all the bad rap DEI is getting these days, our endowment's done a heck of a lot better when it's handled by a more diverse group of people. The way we did this work is not by firing people just because of their color or skin, but rather by intentionally saying who can better manage our endowment and provide a diverse set of perspectives in a very volatile market environment. And that has contributed to the health and well-being of that endowment. So those are some examples. You know, we are reimagining our campus. We brought in a middle school onto our campus to change educational models that we do that include not just graduate level, but conversations that are cross-disciplinary and intergenerational. And I can say more, but we'll stop there for a bit. So, other things, other questions, yep.
David, my name is Clyde. I was the guy sleeping in the back.
All right. Well, sorry to wake you up.
You know, we do come from an island. I have been here for a very long time. I farm in the mud. And I often find that I don't use any words bigger than important and vegetable. So listening to much of this is difficult. I heard you speak about history, and yes, I believe history is cyclic. It repeats itself as it is now. You defined nationalism, but I didn't hear, and I could have been sleeping, you define Christian. Mm-hmm. And why I say this is, as I look at your school of religion, as I look at you as a pastor, I want to believe that there is a greater answer than just us talking together and going out into the community, and that there is a greater hope. And that hope is in Christ Jesus, for me.
Yeah.
I won't say for everyone, but I would like to hear your definition of what it means to be Christian.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. You know, first of all, thank you for the work that you do. That earlier today we had a conversation about, Thich Nhat Hanh using this image that a lotus comes out of the mud, right? It is really, in fact, one of the implications of colonial effort was in this hierarchy, was to place the work of labor with our hands at the lower totem pole of what we value, right? And still in our economic system, the farther your work is from the land, the more money you make, right? So we have to address, and I appreciate you doing that here as well, how we engage more fully with those elements of our daily life that are the ground of our existence, right? And without which we cannot live. For me, I would not be doing this work if I did not have hope in me. First Peter says that we must give an account of the hope that is within us. At this moment, as we feel despair, we do need to find ways to give an account of where that hope comes from us, right? My own hope is rooted in my faith in Jesus Christ. In Jesus' this experience of the birth of a child, again, as I said, in the most offside possible. And that God makes a choice to be born not in places of power, but that's the most unlikely of places. That when it comes to the state's power and violence, Jesus is found, God is found on the cross, not holding the sword. That when the book of Revelations opens up this crisis of an apocalyptic moment, the power does not come from a lion, but from a lamb. So that is where my hope lies, right? And my encouragement for us tonight is to find that deeper well, whatever that is for us, and to share that deeper well, to give an account of that hope more openly to one another. Again, the silence on these conversations of politics, of religion, of our identities, creates a vacuum, either of assumptions or fears about one another. So I appreciate your courage today to speak to your hope, because it opens a different space for us to be able to do that, that moves us from the head truly to the heart, and ultimately leads into action. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for just one more question, and I think there was somebody, Margie, I think, yeah. Come on up and speak directly into the microphone.
Thank you, and good evening. I'm Margie Merriman, and I'm actually the group leader for Kauai Indivisible. I'm also a member of National, and I'm on the state Hawaii team as well. And I'm involved as an activist organizer because of my heart and my love and my compassion for community. And I'm also, my work that I do is in the healing arts. And I see directly the people who come to me who are in pain, how everything that happens in community in our world affects them. And so that's why I pay attention to what's going on. So I have a couple of things. One is today I got a text message and a phone call because of what Donald Trump did today with the executive order. And I had a lot of people contacting me because they were just scared. So I'm like, okay, let me fact check this. And then I called our electeds. And then I'm a pushy broad. And so I'm like, okay, you got to do more than tell me you did a press release, Brian Schatz. What else are you going to do? And so I called and I asked them to take action, make a plan of action, but they needed to tell me, what can I tell my community to help stop the fear? And I said, do I need to get us out on the streets to protest, to get you guys to realize that this is unacceptable? Will you guys shut down the Senate? You know, that's what Indivisible said we should ask them to do. So tonight I came and I enjoyed listening to you, but I was also kind of hoping that maybe we could get some insight, like how to have compassion for the MAGAs, You know, because one part of me this morning was like, well, are you happy with your vote now? Look at you, you're going to lose your food stamps. You're going to do this. You voted against your best interests. And the other part of me was like, oh my gosh, these poor people, what are we going to do? And unfortunately, you know, we have till Monday for the hearing to happen. And I've contacted the state legislators, and everybody I've talked to, I've said, you guys, we have to formulate a plan of action, because we're only 8 days into this, and I'm already exhausted. And we need a plan of action. Like, I have my emergency response team with Indivisible, so we know what we have to do to be the noise machine. And I'm asking the elected leaders, what's your plan? Are you guys talking behind closed doors? Because don't give me, we're gonna just wait to see what's going on. Because I was told that last week when I went to the Capitol to meet with some of our electeds. So I'm here tonight to ask you about how to try to be nice with MAGA. And I'm also here to let the community know, call your elected representatives. It's really easy to call them, talk to them like you're talking to the pastor. They really appreciate it. I say nice things like, you know, eat nutritious food, take your vitamins, if you're in for the long haul. We love you, we appreciate you. And oh, by the way, what are you really going to do? And you just talk to them, and they'll really appreciate it. And they're logging who's calling. So that's the one thing I can say is, and Indivisible, we're starting to go to the county council, because we are going to pay attention to what's going on. But I have a neighbor across the street who's a MAGA. And, you know, and I'm just like, ah. And I don't like that feeling.
Yeah.
So if you have any insights of how we can try to bridge, because I really feel most of the people were misled.
Yeah, completely. But I mean, I think, like in any political process, right, people are motivated by a particular thing that they may feel very convicted of, right? Their fear about safety, the misinformation or understanding about the threat that they feel a foreigner person might have on their lives. And so whether they have been misled or just have been driven by one particular aspect of the agenda, oftentimes people will not understand the whole. So I appreciate the heart for saying, how do we engage people that vote differently than we do? That's why my invitation first is to say, take their religion seriously. Speak about what you care deeply about. The current governance that we are seeing is taking the absolute most extremist version. You know, this is a very divided vote. The nation is still very divided. You know, it's just a slight swing this way and a slight swing that way, right? The nation is deeply divided. So we do have to understand one another. We cannot, what nationalism does is create, this is the way of thinking, everything else is a threat. Everything else is a problem. So what I'm encouraging us to do is to understand, telling people that they're stupid and always repeating that they're voting against their own interests does not necessarily encourage them to participate with us in a different way of thinking. But asking questions about what is it that they're afraid of? What is it that they hope for their children, for their community, and just listening, right? So if we can do nothing else to identify others to build and reconstitute this ecosystem, because it is fractured, it is painful. Religious communities tend to hold a much wider spectrum of conviction and tradition than most other social organizations. You know, most social organizations, actually even progressive ones or conservative ones, tend to gather people around very narrow, appropriately so because we organize. So I do think religious spaces have an opportunity to create that spectrum, right? To be able to actually listen to one another and to engage them. So what are other spaces where we can actually find people with whom we disagree and to bring an openness to understanding what they perceive? Sometimes for our own well-being, we have to walk away from the conversation, right? There are things, and we need to be able to call out some things that we feel. But if we can do it in a way that says, tell me what you think, and I'll tell you what I think, right? Again, it's breaking the silence. I don't know if I'm getting to your question a bit, so hopefully I am. But,
Yeah, I mean, this has been, like you said, 50 years in the making. I figured it was more like 30 years, you know, my lifetime, my lived experience. And there's going to come a point where I'm hoping that people can have that compassion and that openness so that when maybe someone wakes up and realizes, uh-oh, that we're there and that we build a stronger community together.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, while we're under tyranny, we have to understand that we say no. And that's, and come join us at Indivisible.
Yeah. Well, and I think, the fear that you name, so part of it is recognizing there is a reason to be afraid,
So
particularly for those who are most vulnerable. And so how we hold that fear with them.
Yeah, I mean, my
Thank
heart
you.
broke today. I had a lady who said, oh my gosh, if I have my EBT, I won't have food. And I'm already thinking, okay, what do I have in my pantry?
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is
Sure.
there any wrap-up words you want me to say?
Just very, very brief, but if you want to should we go?
We'll take one more question
Go
right
ahead.
there in the front.
Try to get to gender parity here too.
Thank you so much. My name is Sharon. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm kind of a nervous speaker, so bear with me. Thank you, David, very much for what you said. I'm going to give you kind of a micro what we have in our neighborhood. We have people come and go. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sort of a micro in our little neighborhood. We have people who own our places and people who come and go. And in every instant, we have a group and we're all kind of the same thinkers. And yet we have like 3 people who just will Trumpers. And I realize that probably the reason is we don't have the ABC, NBC, CBS like we used to have.
Mm-hmm.
We have social media, we have X, I guess now it's Meta, Fox News, and the conviction that they have, we have 2 different truths.
Yep.
And that 50%, it's amazing that the people we engage with are our friends. We have the same belief system, and yet they're hearing different information, constantly being bombarded with that. And so when you talk about the history, yes, but we're also dealing with a whole new, and when AI comes out and fake, they could take you and have you saying a completely different thing tonight.
Yeah.
And we're up against that. And so I think we're in an era, like you said, this is a really big change that we have faced before, but in a different way.
Well, I appreciate a version of this conversation we're having tonight that we had on campus this fall was actually titled Disruptive AI, Christian Nationalism, and the Future of Democracy, in part because these systems, AI, artificial intelligence, is basically, they're just mathematical models, right? They're numerical models of reality, and they're predictive systems. That's all they are, right? But what they do is they try to understand patterns and then interpret and predict what reality may be, right? And so they can be utilized if you got to follow into technology and that. Religious communities or religions were the original AI. It's humans trying to create models to understand the world around them. What is the relationship between humans and the environment, or how we get here, right? Now, these are not exactly guarantees that this is what it is or it isn't. We pay attention. We listen to how we understand and view the world, and we receive however the tradition understands it. So in a conversation we were saying is these are what are called like keystone technologies. Keystone technologies are the kind of technology that affects everything we do. AI is affecting everything we do. It's a keystone technology that is affecting how we drive around, how we get our health care, how we communicate with one another. Some of it is very good, some of it is very problematic. Religion is a keystone technology. It shapes people's lives, their convictions, how they think of themselves, the decisions they make about how many children they have, or how they might live out their lives and pursue their callings. So part of it is engaging both of these things. And in the quote I made at the beginning from the Economic Forum, these challenges are both distinctly new, but eerily familiar. In that series, which is on our website, psr.edu, there was a partnership with the engineering school at UC Berkeley. Part of what we discuss is the fact that we have the skills to engage and to create an ethical engagement with AI, because the issues that have to be wrestled with are very similar to the ones we have always issued with. access, decision making about assignment of certain values or understandings or allocation of resources. So the way that we need to create an ethical framework to manage the consequences, both intended and unintended, of AI, we have within us, right? We have the practices for it. We just need to figure out a way to engage them. So thank you for your time tonight. I really greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
So I just wanted to thank Dr. Vasquez-Levy for his time here with us this evening. And I also want to say that I think these kinds of conversations are really important for us to have. And sometimes there's some discomfort, some disagreement. And I think we need to embrace that as well and say, we're struggling with all of this together. And so I'm going to invite all of you who are a part of a church or not a part of a church, but other community of whatever it is, to engage in these kinds of conversations and help each other figure out for you what works, what's working, what do you want to do that might make a difference next? How can you be community together and make a difference in these challenging times? So that's just a little bit of encouragement, but I wanted to say that whenever we gather together as the United Church of Christ, we give just really brief opportunities, like 20 to 30 seconds, if any churches have any announcements. And I'm going to start just by saying, as a reminder, we have a reception with some nice food right over here. It's a good opportunity to talk to David. I know some of you still had questions, and we just don't have time for all the questions tonight, so maybe we'll do something like this again. But David will stick around for a while. Michelle will be over here also. I will be around if you have questions as a former trustee at Pacific School of Religion. And then I also know that there are some students that have taken courses at Pacific School of Religion in the Theological Education and Leadership program. And we have one of those students, or one of those persons in our congregation that was one of those students. We don't have time for her to talk about her experience tonight, but Tiffany Marathi grew up in this church, and she went through the TEL program, got certified, became our youth director, and the chairperson for the Kauai Association Young Youth and Young Adult Committee. But I just wanted Tiffany to wave back there. If you'll come over here and just, I wanted us to give Tiffany a hand for getting through the program. And also acknowledge, I know there's some other people here and in the community that have gone through the entire program and gotten certified, but there's also people that have just taken 1 or 2 or 3 courses. So I encourage you to look at the PSR website and think about what are some courses that you might want to take as an individual or some people from your church or in your community that might be helpful for you. And it might just be to start the conversation, but please consider doing that. The other thing I'm just going to say really quickly is I'm very excited that for a couple of years our church has been raising money to put a brand new church kitchen together. And as of this week, our church kitchen is complete. Hallelujah. So that we can put on, so we can actually put on a reception for all of you tonight. So it was getting pretty close to not finishing, but we just finished our kitchen. Feel free to poke your head in there and see that. And that's also going to allow our church, Koloa Union Church, to host the Aha Mokupuni for the Kauai Association of the United Church of Christ, May 9th and 10th. We'll be announcing that to all the churches very soon. So Koloa Union Church will be gathering all the churches for an Aha Mele, a wonderful time of music celebration that Friday night, and then we have our annual meeting. But we couldn't do that without our church kitchen because we provide meals for people who come as well. So that's my announcement for this church. Are there any other churches that have announcements that you just feel like you need to share with people right now? If so, come up to a microphone and let us know. I don't see any hands. And so let's give David Vasquez-Levy a hand one more time. And we are going to make our way out, and feel free to talk with David and come to the reception and have some good food and something to drink.
And if you permit me to do, as a form of a benediction for our time together, as a thing religious communities do, This is a quote from Howard Thurman, so please take a deep breath. All around us, worlds are dying, and new worlds are being born. All around us, life is dying, and life is being born. The fruit ripens on the tree. The roots are silently at work in the darkness of the earth against a time when there shall be new lives, fresh blossoms, green fruit. Such is the growing edge. It is the extra breath from the exhausted lung, the one more thing to try when all else has failed. The upward reach of life when weariness closes in upon all endeavor. This is the basis of hope in moments of despair. The incentive to carry on when times are out of joint and people have lost their reason. The source of confidence when worlds crash and dreams whiten into ash. The birth of a child, life's most dramatic answer to death. This is the growing edge incarnate. Look well to the growing edge. Amen.